Okay, our next topic is high-yielding wheat and what the UK yen program has found. Our next speaker is Roger Sylvester-Bradley from the UK. Roger was one of the innovators that developed the yield enhancement network in the UK more than 12 years ago. Much information has been reviewed and shared with growers, and Roger is one of those that makes it all happen and deciphering all this data. He's going to share with us today what they have learned. So, Roger, whenever you're ready, enlighten us.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I have to say this is a great privilege for me and an honor to be speaking to all of you. I've got written on my label here, creator of the yen. So to have all of you listening to me talk about the yen miles away from where we started is a real privilege, and I hope I can do the yen and all the colleagues that are involved in the yen here, as well as in the UK, justice with this talk. So I'm a crop scientist. I started the yen in 2012 when we had the Olympics in London. And at that stage, I was very frustrated as a scientist because I didn't know what was happening on farms. We were doing hundreds of experiments which told us what we thought was happening on farms, but it wasn't really what was happening on farms. And I looked at the athletes, and there they were, the winners were winning, and a lot of the rest of the people were not winning. And I wondered, how did they think about how to get to win? Well, they all have lots of data. And as a scientist, that's what I like. I like data, lots of data to explain what's going on. And so we have now in the yen's been going for 13 years in the UK. We have, this is the forward button, yes. We have our winners. In fact, we only have two that have got the world records. These are the world record yields of, 5 crops that we can grow in the UK. And Tim Lammerman, and it's, I think, quite significant that he's got 4 of the world records. And Richard Budd has the field bean record because Tim Lammerman doesn't grow field beans. So what I want to do now is to look at the data, look at because they created those world records as part of the yen. We have an excellent database to try and explain what's going on and what all the other farmers who have been trying to compete with them have been achieving. So the database that we've got now is about double the yen that's we've been going about twice as long or a bit more, and it's about double the size of your yen. So we've got for wheat yields we've got 1144 over the 10-year period to 2022. I'm only analysing that decade, the first decade, and you will see that the black dots are all the entries. And there are 10% that are actually abroad, either in Ireland or over in Denmark or in Sweden, and a few in the Netherlands. But 90% are in the UK, but they're spread right from the south to the north, mainly on the east, which is where our arable farming happens. And you can see the colours indicate the potential yields, and the potential yields I've expressed there in your units. They're all generally above the yields that we're achieving. We believe that the actual potential of our environments, although they vary enormously, are still allowing us to make progress, even though on average we're not making progress. So that's a big contrast between you and us, is that you're making progress with your yields as far as we can see, and whereas we haven't been making progress for about 30 years, and that's our big frustration. So the first thing is the splendid potential. So why are we not realizing that potential? I say plenty of potential. I don't know whether any of you watch Clarkson Farm, but Clarkson Farm happens to be in this little yellow patch here, which has the lowest yield potential of the whole of the UK. So obviously the yields do vary, and nevertheless, his yield potentials will be way above what he is actually achieving. The yields range enormously from 70 up to 287. The 287 exceeds the world record because it wasn't a validated yield. So the huge variation in yields, and that gives us a huge ability to try and explain what's going on. And then we have this large set of data to explain all that's happening, 400 or more different metrics that cover all the weather, the soil, the agronomy, and the characteristics of the crop. And we've included some characteristics that even scientists don't normally measure. And that actually proved quite useful to us in the end, as you will see. But the first thing that I have to do in the UK to a group of farmers who are not all perhaps persuaded that high yields is what they should be aiming for, because they say, doesn't it cost them a lot of money? Well, I haven't got time to go through all the data that proves that high yields are a good thing, but the 1,144 yields that we've got in the EN database clearly show that you make more profit with high yields, that in fact your costs hardly increase at all in proportion to the yields. The costs are very variable depending on whether you've got a disease to control or a weed to control that proves very expensive in herbicides, or that you've got a low phosphorus index that needs building up with a lot of phosphate fertilizer. But generally, there is only about, I'm going to do it in pounds per ton, but it's about 10 pounds per ton extra cost for every 10 pounds for every extra ton that the yen farmers produce. So, and they're getting 160, so they're getting 16 times that in their extra ton of grain. I think the answer is going to be something of, I don't know, anyway. But the other things that we are a very populous country in the UK. Most of the public are not involved in agriculture, and they care what their countryside looks like. And in fact, the subsidies that we get are more concerned with the environmental benefits of agriculture rather than the productivity of agriculture now. And but obviously, if you're growing more food, you're going to need less land to produce the food for the country. So that's the first good thing. If you're a more efficient farmer growing these high-yielding crops with not huge amount of more inputs, even nitrogen doesn't increase a huge amount per ton of extra grain, then you get less pollution from the high-yielding crops than you do from the low-yielding crops. There's no more risk involved, as we can see, in aiming for high yields, and the carbon footprint of high-yielding crops is less than the carbon footprint of low-yielding crops. And that's excluding the fact that because you're saving land, whoops, where have I gone? Because you're saving land, you're actually saving inadvertently, indirectly, you're saving people from having to clear rainforest or whatever it might be to grow more crops, grow more food. So high yields, I have to say, are a good thing. And if you are interested in our report, I've put a QR code that hopefully you'll be able to pick up if you look at the video of this talk. So this is what a high-yielding crop looks like. This is one of Tim Lammerman's crops, one that I happened to visit at the end of June in 2020. The world record was in 2022, which was 18 tons per hectare. This was about 15 tons per hectare. And what I've done is to take the 60 yields that we've got that average more than 208 bushels per acre, and characterize those here, compared with the average of the yen, which yields about 11 times 15 is 162. 162. So the first thing is that these high yields are 38% more than the average, okay? But they get there by having primarily, and most of all, it's by having a larger number of heads, fertile heads, but also, as well, they have a higher number of grains per head, and we have significantly higher grains per head than you have. Pardon me. And so we have 10% more grains per head than the average of the yen grower. We have 5% larger grains, but remember that's 32,000 grains are being grown for these high yields, so that's a very large amount of extra photosynthate that has to go into the grain at the end of the year. And the grain filling period is significantly 18% longer than the average. So these high yielding crops last a long time. And to me, that's the sort of essential basic finding that we've got out of the yen. So what I want to do now is I have an ambition of writing a book that says this is how you grow a 15-ton, which I've forgotten the number for, but 208 bushel. So call this is my recipe for growing 200 bushels. I'm going to go through it step by step, and it goes through the season and describes the characteristics that you've got to try and achieve, and then the rest of the talk will be what the data tells us about how you do the agronomy to get these steps all the way along the way. But a high-yielding crop is basically a big crop that lasts a long time, and this is the detail of that. So I'm going to go step by step. The first thing is you have to have access to moisture all the way through the season. So you need to know what's going on in your subsoil. You need to be able to estimate how deep your roots are going, and we've got the farmers doing that with us. And you need to watch whether that's increasing or not year by year. You need to sow at an optimum time and choose an optimum variety. And we just heard from Eric a lot about your variety choice. We have a similar operation going on in the UK, a lot of investment in genetics and plant breeding, and there's evidently value in selecting the most recently bred varieties. But you need to choose them to prolong the life of the crop. We don't have the sophistication of the tiller angle and so on to help us from the data that we get from our variety testing organization, but we need to ideally look for flowering relatively early. At the moment, flowering is in early June, but possibly late May might be worth trying, and they need to senesce right at the end of July, whereas most crops senesce before the end of July. We need about 250 plants established, and having them in narrow rows is better than having them in wide rows. There's an advantage, and we find an advantage in warm winters, which encourage root exploration. And we are tending to get warmer winters. We've got to build this large tiller number, and we find that phosphorus nutrition is particularly important in that, not just nitrogen. Obviously, nitrogen is very important for that, but phosphorus nutrition is important for that. And the optimum plant height in our data set is 70 centimeters. So the ear formation is primarily under genetic control, as far as I can see from the data. but there is some sort of indication that the copper status of the crop is important at that stage. There's a positive relationship between the grain number and the copper status of the crop. The green canopy because we've got the most important phase of the crop is the grain filling period, what we call the production phase. We have to try and ensure that phase is going to last a long time, and the canopy is going to have to last a long time, and that means having nutrition available in the canopy at the point of flowering is sufficient to keep those leaves alive, whilst the grain is also taking some of those nutrients, particularly phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, and zinc, apparently, going into the crop during grain filling. We have to ensure that those nutrients are relatively high in order to get the canopy to last a long time. And these high-yielding crops generally have apparent water capture going down to 2 meters deep. So the depth of the soil that you really need to know in the UK is down to 2 meters and maybe even more in some of the light soils.
We will, in places, will suffer from a dense subsoil. And so what would be the bulk density of your soils down at between 1 and 2 meters?
Well, it's obviously a hugely variable, and I actually think our soils are probably more variable than yours. So the question was, what was the bulk density of the subsoil down there? And subsoils are obviously more dense than topsoils. Topsoils are generally something like 1.3 to 1.4, whereas the subsoils, I hesitate to give a general answer, but possibly up in the 1.5 to 1.7. Yeah.
That's deep.
Sorry?
That's deep.
Yeah. I mean, what we find is that farmers really don't understand the relationship between the characteristics of their soils and the water holding capacity of the soil. And it would be, I blame my fellow scientists who are soil scientists, and I love soil scientists. I've got a wife who's a soil scientist, but they don't characterize the soils in crop-friendly terms, so crop managers' terms. And so we need to understand how the soil is holding water, each farm by farm. And lastly, we're looking for the canopy to stay alive right through to the end of July. And when I go, if I go instead of the end of June, visit Tim Lammerman, if I go at the end of July, I am astonished that every crop I drive past has died. His still have 4 green leaves. Right. I hope you didn't see that. I was going to ask, how much control do you think you have over yield? I mean, we've heard about the genetics. So we've got variation going from, 70 in bushels per acre, 70 to up to 200 and nearly 300. And how much control do our farmers have over that? And I'm going to offer you 20%, 40%, or 80%. And so hands up for 20% control. Oh, you're all very optimistic. 40% control. There's a few hands there. 80% control. There's a hand or two there. Okay, well, the answer is 40% control. In our data, and this is my attempt as a scientist to understand this is on-farm data, I can't explain a third of it. I can't explain a third of the variation. I can explain 2/3 of the variation, which is not bad, actually, as a scientist with a pretty random collection of yields. A quarter of it is to do with year, which, as I'm saying we can't control, and the 40% is apparently open to control. But then I wonder how much of that you think is actually year-to-year control, and how much is decade-to-decade control. And I'm not going to get you to give me the answers, but the answers are here. Basically, you have much more control decade by decade, or in the long term, than you do in the short term. The sorts of things that when we're choosing our variety, actually the influence of variety is remarkably small, I have to say, in this variation. Now, there could be artificial reasons for that, and I'm certainly not saying that variety selection is not a good ambition, but it definitely is something that needs to be put in context. Right. I'm going to now, because I think my time, it's not too bad, I'm going to go through from the direction over here, so the region and the climate and the decade by decade controls that you have go through to the more annual husbandry, field by field decisions that you have, and just summarize very quickly what the yen data say, this large body of data that we managed to collect. So I'm going to start with the strategy, and the first thing, and you can't be, this isn't at all controversial, is that farms differ, and each of you and each of your farms need to be regarded as unique, but that gives you a responsibility. You need to get to understand that farm, and you need to go and understand yourself and the way you make decisions. And the phrase that we've used, and I think Joanna and Dennis use this phrase as well, is attention to detail. That's the characteristic of us as managers is, the characteristic of the winning farmers gives us the impression that they're very assiduous, very manage things very closely. And I've tried, because we had a project particularly on nitrogen across Europe in the last 3 years, we've tried to sort of put that into sort of doable terms, because attention to detail is a bit sort of bland and poorly defined. So we've suggested that crop management should be regarded as having 3 steps, and the step that we're focusing on with the yens, and which I think is distinctly poor amongst our European farmers, is the reviewing step. So there has to be an initial reviewing step in whatever decision you're trying to make. You have to have your own data, you have to be able to characterize the influences on whatever you're trying to decide, and you then move into your planning phase and into your check and adjust phase of your management cycle. And it is a cycle, and it's I'm glad to see that the average age here is quite mature. And that probably means that you've learned a lot, and that's why I really love coming to talk to groups like yourselves. Right, I'm going to go through the different aspects of farm choice. So we have know and improve your soils. And here's Tim Lammerman standing above a pit when Dennis and Joanna and everybody brought a group to visit Tim in June last year. And I mean, it doesn't look like a world record soil, but it is the soil where he grows his world record crops. And I can describe it, it's not what it looks like that matters. It's the water it holds, the air it allows, it's the cracks that it has that allows the roots to grow deep into the soil. And he is extracting water from 2 meters at least deep in this soil, and that's because it's actually a chalk soil. It's developed from chalk deposits. Must have been laid down millions of years ago under the sea, but now it's high up in Lincolnshire, and it really doesn't waterlog. I don't think Tim has to have drainage on his land, but most soils would need to, in our climate, would need to have drainage to minimize waterlogging. Okay, so And Tim talks a lot about his efforts to control the uniformity of his land, and it's something that comes out of the end data, that farmers that choose a small patch within their fields have high yields, and that's presumably because the rest of the field was going to yield less. And my inference from that is that we need to pay attention to that those lower yielding patches and try and improve them. And build the soil productivity by, I mean, there's a lot of talk about soil health. I much prefer the term soil productivity because it gives you a measure. It's, you know, how much yield are you actually getting out of your soil? And so the organic matter content is, in fact, it's not significantly related to yield, surprisingly, but certainly the use of organic manures, as you'll see in a minute, is. But definitely the rootable depth and particularly the moisture holding capacity of the subsoil is related to yield in our data. Now rotations, there's nothing particularly striking or brand new in the data set here, but if you're growing wheat after wheat or barley in our conditions, then you can expect to lose something of the order of 15 bushels per acre. And that the best crops to be growing wheat after are canola or pulses. Cultivations, we've compared all four sort of types of cultivation through from plough to no-till, and no-till does show at a disadvantage, and that does corroborate international reviews that have gone on, which show a sort of 2 to 5% reduction in yield with no-till. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm about no-till, particularly in regenerative philosophies for agronomy, and it's not to be dismissed, certainly, because there are huge advantages in the flexibility that it gives you and the timeliness that it gives you in being able to establish the crop. So I'm not saying keep away from no-till, but just appreciate that you probably have to do something to accommodate the disadvantages. Right, now I move through to sort of more tactical year-by-year, field-by-field decisions. And the variety case has been well made this morning before I got on my feet. And what we find in the end data is that pretty much what our farmers achieve fully reflects what our variety testers say are the differences between the varieties, okay? And that basically means that the older the variety you grow, and in this graph here, we've got varieties chosen to grow in the yen in the same year they're introduced by the breeder, and then we have successively older ages of variety down to 17 years, and you can see there's a substantial yield loss as the variety choice gets older. So it's, well, a straightforward, and farmers do, you know, generally, most of the entries, the numbers of entries are in the middle there, you can't read them, but most of the entries are within 5 years of being introduced. Most of the variety choice happens then. But there was one surprise in analyzing the yen variety data, in that we find that varieties that are relatively early are showing an advantage over the varieties that are middling or late. We don't have data on flowering of our varieties, but this does relate to flowering of the varieties in the end data. So, and this also relates to the fact that in this data set, we've seen significant weather change, particularly global warming. The temperatures have gone up by about 0.5 degree over the 10 years, which is double what the meteorologists say has actually happened in the UK. So I'm a bit puzzled why it's changed so much, but certainly we've got warming, and we've got no change in flowering dates, but we've got significantly earlier maturity dates. So we've got the grain filling period has actually been shortened on average by a fortnight during the 10 years, which is a lot. and really something I think generally, globally, we should be addressing and considering when should our crops flower. But at the end of the day, as I say, and this could be because the yen growers are so good at sort of picking up on the new breeding material that they're all exploiting the modern genetics, and so we don't see a huge variation although we've got this huge variation in yield, not very much of it, only 1% of it is actually to do with choosing varieties. Right. Sowing and establishment. Again, there's nothing particularly new. We sow between August and November. Generally, the norm is to sow in early October. There's actually a slight advantage in the end data from sowing in late September or during September. The seed rate, when you do the analysis, because every so much delay in drilling causes you to sow more seeds, we actually have a confusion in our minds between whether it's the sowing date or the seed rate that's causing this effect. So is low seed rate a good thing, or is early sowing a good thing? That's the question in our minds. And one of our growers, who's actually one of our winners, has been doing experiments that's clearly showing that actually these narrow rows and lower seed rates tend to produce a small advantage. Right, nutrition. I spent my life working on crop nutrition, and I'm going to try and do a sort of very superficial summary in 2 slides, or 2 or 3 slides. But there's clearly an advantage in the end data from application of organic manures. I attribute this to the continual release that we get from organic manures of phosphorus. And when we look at the phosphorus nutrition and the relationship of the different yield components to nutritional status, then I've been surprised to see that tillering has a positive relationship with phosphorus status of the soil and with the application of phosphorus. The application of phosphorus didn't in the end affect the yield, but it certainly affected the tillering. And I wonder whether there's some lessons to learn about that. And when we look at analysis of leaf nutrients, I know that the industry generally, globally, focuses on the spring, because that's when you're mainly applying your fertilizers, and you sort of feel that the analysis of the crop at that stage might be telling in what you should be applying. I have to say that I can find no relationship between those early analyses and yield in the end data, but what I can find is a good relationship with the nutritional status of the crop at flowering and yield. So that's why I said earlier that I think we need to look at the nutritional status of the crop that we're constructing, if you like, at flowering as being particularly important in determining the longevity of the canopy through the vitally important grain filling period. The one thing that we've introduced in 2016 in the end, we asked the laboratories whether they could analyze phosphorus as well as nitrogen in our grain, and they said, well, if we analyze phosphorus, we can analyze everything. Why don't we do everything? So, and they were giving us analysis for free. So since 2016, we've been analyzing all nutrients in the grain, and that's been enormously telling. It has completely transformed my understanding of crop nutrition and the way it varies. And I particularly would pick up this difference between farms. I can go into a region, a county within the UK, and I can have 6 different farms, and they'll all have 6 different patterns of nutritional status of their wheat crops or whatever crops they're analyzing. So it's a vitally important thing. We've got most farmers doing this now. Initially, they found it a challenge because harvest in the UK is a very stressful time, and they didn't want an extra job to do. But we made out a nice simple instruction sheet, and it basically just needs planning. You just need to be ready with your buckets and your bags, ready to get those samples out of each trailer as they come into the store. Okay, that's all I'm going to do on nutrition. I could talk a lot about the data that comes out of that, but hopefully we'll, in other meetings this week, have a chance to do that. Crop protection, again, I've only not got a lot to say about this, but we have these interesting associations between yield in the ends and, first of all, PGR use. So if you look at the literature on PGRs, there's really no evidence that PGRs, in the absence of lodging, increase yield. But in the end, we have this positive and very clear association between yield level and PGR use. And we think this is just that our farmers are good at anticipating the particular yield that they're going to get, and they make the right, if you like, insurance decision about what level of PGR application to use. And really a similar thing probably affects the use of fungicides. So we've got a high use of fungicides associated with greater yields in the end data set. I would particularly point out that the T3 application at growth stage 59, just before flowering, shows as being particularly important. And again, I attribute this to the importance in our conditions of having this prolonged canopy life during grain filling. So, I'm doing all right. Good. So just simply to conclude, high yield, the end data set is an absolute, I was going to say minefield, that's not the right word, but it's an absolute treasure chest of information, and I've just skimped over the surface of it this morning, but I'm busily spending months working with the data and trying to work through to, well, I would love to do this guide for a 15-ton crop, a 200 bushel crop, or whatever it is. Because I think we've got the information now to help us write that. So high wheat yields come from dense crops with a big biomass, and they need to live a long time. That is pure and simple, and they need to grow. There need to be no phases in the life of the crop. People think about critical phases, and I'm not a particular advocate of talking about critical phases. I just think the whole process has to have momentum. That's what the sort of phrase I try to use. So the control that you have is partial, and it includes all those things that go into the way you manage, and the characteristics of your soil, and the way you design the choice of products you're going to produce. All those things have an influence on your yield levels, as well as the tactics that we generally focus on in meetings like this. And certainly, through my career, that's what I've focused on, and how to use nitrogen advantageously and so on. We have a very clear climate change challenge in the UK, and this is not just the UK, it's right across Europe. Basically, in the next 30 years, where I used to work in Cambridge, is going to be more like Spain. It's going to be dramatically different, and I imagine the same. You need to be looking south at what's going on down there and work out how that can influence what you decide to do. And then particularly, I'm thinking we need to work with the plant breeders about that, because for me, we should try and loosen the link between photoperiod, which doesn't change with the climate, and when the crop flowers. And when the crop flowers is a very important moment in the life of the crop. So skill, it's a mixture of skill and good luck, and that's clearly what the farming yen data show. I'm feel enormously privileged to have access to the data set, so I just wish you in all your futures. Good luck. I don't expect, I don't expect what I've said to be immediately informative for how you should be farming, but certainly the sort of the overall approach and the need to review what's going on in your farm, to measure what's going on in your farm so that you can make your informed decisions, because every farm is unique. So thank you very much.
So we can take questions for about 10 minutes. Can you answer questions for another 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that.
I'm not only dumb, but deaf.
Okay.
Can I walk up to people and just hear them? That's probably the best thing.
You showed the tillage there. How deep is that deep tillage that you showed? To me, that looked like a cultivator.
Yeah, you're probably right. I probably chose the wrong photograph. But yeah, I mean, the general depth of, no, you're going to want it in inches, 8 inches. Yeah.
Is there a way to quantify how much that grain fill period influences yield? And then secondly, is there much the producer can do to either, to extend that grain fill period?
I mean, that is what I would love
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. So the question is, what is the link between yield and the grain filling period? And how can we influence the length of that grain filling period? And I mean, the first answer is there's a strong relationship between them. I mean, when you're looking at, it's a ridiculous voice I've got, but it's not normally like this. But when you're dealing with hundreds of farmers across many countries, the variation is due to huge numbers of things. So getting the relationship between one specific thing and yield is a challenge. But there is definitely a relationship between them. As I've said, there's a climate effect on them. The varieties are highly photoperiod sensitive, so that whilst we've seen half a degree of warming through the whole year, in the end, we've seen no significant change in the flowering dates, but we have seen this earlier maturity and lower yields associated with that. So I think the things we can do is work with the breeders to look at varieties that have less photoperiod sensitivity that will bring flowering earlier. But then we need, in order to max it, because if you just did that, you'd have a lower yield, probably, because they just mature earlier. So you've got to do everything agronomically to try and keep that crop alive for as long as possible. And I said it was 59 days, which is a long time to have grain filling going on. Yeah.
Question.
What is a fortnight and what is your latitude in UK? You said at grain filling time, I think you said shortened by a fortnight?
Yes.
How many days is that?
A fortnight, 14 days.
Okay, 14 days. And what is your latitude in the UK?
What is
The
the...
latitude, we're at kind of like
we're,
42, 43, are you?
we're 58.
So you get a lot more sunlight during it per day then.
We, more than what? More than what? We, this voice is ridiculous. The solar radiation in the UK, even though you're right that the further you go north, the longer the summer days, actually the total solar radiation that we receive in the north is less than in the south. Okay, so, but remember, 58 degrees is misleading because anywhere else in the world with 58 probably wouldn't be growing wheat. But because we have the Gulf Stream, never mind what the Gulf's called, but the Gulf Stream, we are warm. And You know, so are Denmark and Germany and so on.
So with that just being said, with the Gulf Stream that comes your way, you actually have a longer growing period because
Yeah,
your
yeah.
wheat never goes dormant, does it?
Correct.
So you're growing longer. I can see where you get more yields. You just mentioned it. You have a longer growing time.
Yeah.
Here we have April, May, June, July, 4 months.
Yeah,
You've
yeah.
got actually
But
8
you do
months.
sow in the autumn, fall,
Yeah.
the fall.
But our wheat goes dormant. It stops growing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay, so we lose
Yeah.
December, January, February.
Yeah.
And part of March.
yeah,
So you've gained 4 months on it. I've been there when they're harvesting beets in February, February.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
harvesting beets in
yeah, yeah,
February.
yeah, they do.
So we're actually not comparing apples to apples here because you're.
No, 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 no. Nobody's set me up to tell you what to do. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying what happens in Northwest Europe,
Yeah.
and I'm talking about the sort of the more strategic way that the industry, our industry, could work. And you know, it's still a fight to try and persuade governments and check off organizations, you know, ours isn't as good as yours. So, you know, this is the way we should operate. But farm data, for me, is absolutely vital. And I don't think that is wrong for you either. I think we can transfer that. But I'm not saying, you know, that cold winter, and I'm going to Lithuania and Latvia next week to talk to them too, and I'm hoping you can tell me how you get a high yield in your conditions where it's frozen for 3 months or 4 months or whatever it is. But
I'll ask one if you want. So if you listen to our climatologist, he will tell you that our temperatures are increasing, but it's the overnight lows that are increasing. How does that impact wheat growth?
yeah, so the question is that the climatologists here say the overnight lows are increasing more than the average is increasing. Is that
The
right?
average is increasing, but it's driven by the overnight lows.
Yes, but what I would then want to ask them is that in the winter or in the summer.
Winter.
Yeah, well, it'll be useful if you can get the overnight lows to get above zero.
So he has said our growing season has got longer.
Yeah,
So on the front end,
yeah,
when we are still, we get out of dormancy sooner, yes.
yeah. So the question is, Teresa, you're Teresa. So is saying that the possibility is that you will have less of a dormant period. Yeah, and that's all the good. For me, that's all good. I mean, when we look at the relationship between winter temperatures and yield in our data, the higher the temperatures, these warmer temperatures actually associate with good yields. And I assume it's because the roots and the tillers can keep growing during that period and you're setting up a better structure.
All right. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Grab something out of the basket too. Go ahead. So he gave us a lot of information, and a couple of things that I took away from it is, in correlation with the yen that we're having here in the Michigan, is biomass. You know, growing big biomass. Biomass converts to more yield. That's one of the takeaways, and it sounds like they're using a lot of manure in their rotation too. Not everybody has access to that, but definitely that's important. Planting early with lower seeding rates. Planting early with lower seeding rates. That's another takeaway. And then pay attention to details. That's the tough one, to spend more time in your field and pay attention to details. So with that, now we are going to take a half-hour break. We're going to reconvene at 11. So get something to eat if you want, fill up your cups, and see our vendors in the hallway. Make sure you talk to them and try to get some information from them. So let's take a break. We're going to reconvene at 11 o'clock.